In astrology, a little bit of a sidetrack, but here we go. There are 12 signs of the zodiac, but they're actually opposites. 6 opposites, you can imagine, 6 opposites. It has been said by some astrologers that there's actually only 6 signs of the zodiac because opposite signs are actually feed on each other. It's 2 sides of the same coin. Does anybody know what the opposite of Taurus is? Scorpio. And that whole axis from Taurus to Scorpio, that's called the axis of discipleship. Whereas the previous axis, Pisces, you know what the opposite of Pisces is? Virgo. Pisces was launched the Christian movement 2,000 years ago. That's why Jesus' disciples were largely talked about as fishermen. And that's why it's a water sign, so it has a lot to do with heart. And the opposite sign is Virgo, the virgin concept, you see. But we're moving into, but now it's another axis, and it's for you and I, if you're Taurian, if you're a part of the new group of world servers, this other axis is also very important, and that is to be a light bringer, to see yourself as you have a responsibility to build a form, to bring something into tangible expression. But the only way that can be successful is in 2 things: when the eye is opening, but also when you deal with Scorpio. And remember Scorpio. Whew. Any Scorpions in here? Anybody born in Scorpio? Oh. We have a brave one that goes, yes, 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 yes. Yeah. I think you should move away very slowly. Just joking, just joking. Because Scorpio is called the sign of the test in ancient occultism. And it's also called the sign of discipleship because it's where you have to prove your fitness to serve the greater life. And talk is cheap in the spiritual community, if you hadn't noticed. You've got to prove it. And what is the test? Well, you know, before you're on the path, Scorpio has a lot to do with testing in the outer world. But when you're on the path, it's much more about the inner test, to see how willing we are, each of us. How willing are we to look deep inside ourselves, to find the thing we hope we won't find but must. It is to find the shadow deep inside. It's to find every facet of your consciousness that is preventing the soul from further blooming. And to be dealing with your own stuff and transforming it. Scorpio is all about the transformation of the shadow. Or the shadow would be, excuse me, the shadow, I'm using a Jungian term here. Carl Jung would call it the shadow. In Christianity, they probably would call it the devil within. And in the ancient Greeks would call it the dragon, the 9-headed Hydra. Yes. And in esotericism, it's called the Immortal Head, yeah. The Immortal Head. That's right, there's one head. Yeah. It's interesting, what she's referencing is this idea that there's an ancient story in Greece called the Labors of Hercules. And Hercules was a hero figure and a god figure in ancient Greece. And there's this story about how Hercules has to go through 12 labors to prove his fitness to serve the greater life. And when we look at that ancient story with esoteric eyes, we see that it's a metaphor for the journey of the soul around the 12 signs of the zodiac. And she's referencing an aspect of the 8th labor, which is that corresponds to the 8th sign, and that's Scorpio. And it's a story about how Hercules, the presiding one, approaches Hercules, and that's the inner master, by the way, and says to Hercules that there's this, that he's been told to go out into this land where there's this dragon, and this dragon has 9 heads, and each head breathes fire, and it's called the 9-headed Hydra, and he's been told to go out, find it, and slay it. Well, that's a metaphor for the Hydra inside us. And that each head in mythology is associated with some aspect of the shadow. So one head might be pride, another envy, another fear. I always figured, why they chose 9 heads, I don't know. I always think 900's more like it for most of us, but oh well, 9, so we go with 9. But the idea was he had to go out and find it, and it's a story about doing battle with this 9-headed Hydra. So how's your battle with your Hydra going? Because that's really what we have to do. And see,
of course, the Immortal Head, I could be wrong, but my impression this time round with Scorpio was that the Immortal Head is what feeds the 9 and keeps them alive. So he slays one, another one comes up.
yes,
The Immortal Head is actually the nurturer and sustainer of all those things. So he has to slay them in a particular way to reveal the Immortal Head.
Yeah.
So that has to be, he has to deal with that.
Yeah.
And that has to be put under the rock, under the wave.
yeah, okay. So she's embellishing the story because it's true. It's the story that he takes on all these dragon heads, and he's cutting these heads off as he's attacking this thing. But every time he cuts a head off, 2 sprout where one was, and he says, "This is not good." And then essentially he realizes that he has to surrender, and because he remembers that the presiding one, which was the inner master, had whispered a clue in his ear before he left, and he had forgotten the clue until this moment, and that the clue was this: we rise by kneeling, we gain by yielding. That's the clue. And so he drops all of his weapons and he kneels in supplication to this hideous creature, which is, of course, his own self, his lower nature. But in the yielding and the surrender, what happens? He has a flashing intuition that crosses his mind. And the intuition was to reach down into the mud under the Hydra and with his mighty strength lift it out of its rootedness in matter and hold it high into the sunshine. So that's what he did. And it began to dissolve right in his hand, except one head, which is what Mary's talking about. And that's called, in mythology, that's been called the Immortal Head. He cuts the head off and it's seething with power and fire, and he digs a hole and he throws the head into the hole. Then he takes a boulder and puts it on top of the hole, and then he puts his foot on top of the boulder. And by some accounts, he has to stand there for eternity, which always confuses me because I don't know how he's going to do the next labor. But he's found it on the rock. He's found it on the rock for all eternity. So there's a lot of ways that can be interpreted, but it's really about learning how to be psychological to yourself. Scorpio is the sign that rules psychology, the whole profession of psychology. So if you're a disciple, and if you're part of the new group of world servers, whether you're born in Scorpio or not, in a way, Scorpio and Taurus rule in many ways. How willing are you to look inside yourself to face that stuff? It's like learning how to be both a therapist and a client to yourself. And it requires bone honesty. Bone honesty. And when the shadow has been completely transformed, so there's no dragon head at all, that's enlightenment. That's enlightenment. So a master is somebody that has no more dragon left, no more shadow left, no more the so-called dweller on the threshold is gone. For you and I, we might have a little more work to do. Yeah. Welcome to the club. Welcome to the club. Yeah. So before I go on, are there any other further questions? Any questions you'd like to ask at this point? Anything crossing your mind you'd like to clarify? Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
On Scorpio, one question.
Yeah, sure.
Please, William. Is in the constellation of Scorpio, and I am not well, I don't understand very well all the stars in the constellation, but is there an offering to die to something in Scorpio where we can actually let go of the old for the new to come?
Yes. Okay. So her question is.
Scorpio, that there's an opportunity for us to die to something that no longer serves us.
That's right.
And
So
new birth.
for the sake of the recording, I'm going to try to remember to repeat these questions. So she's asking, does Scorpio have something to do with death to things that no longer serve you, and a resurrection or rebirth. And that's exactly true. I mean, absolutely. It is the great sign of death and resurrection. Death to previous definitions of who you thought you were, and a resurrection into a higher dimension of yourself. And the whole journey is about letting go as a function of opening up to something wider. You know, it's so interesting because the whole journey, from the beginning of the path when you step onto the probationary path to all the initiations leading to the master, to be a master, that whole journey is a journey of renunciations.
That be a reference to what Jesus says in born again?
What, say again?
What Jesus says in being born again.
Yes. Is it a reference to what Jesus said in terms of being born again? And the answer is metaphorically, absolutely. But it's born again many times. Not in a reincarnational sense, of course that's true too, but coming into a new part of yourself, a new dimension of yourself. See, it's death and resurrection, and why Scorpio is so difficult is that the death thing seems to it happens before the resurrection thing. It's just a funny way to put it. But you have to go through a difficult period in order to come into a higher part of yourself. Now, those of you who have been studying this for a while, you know that there is one ray of the 7 rays that is said to govern the whole human kingdom. Do you know what that ray is? Well, that's actually bigger. That governs all the kingdoms in a certain sense. But there's one, it's the ray that corresponds to the 4th kingdom, the 4th ray. The 4th ray, you remember now, all of humanity is understood as one being, one entity. And it has a soul, and it has a personality. And its soul nature is 4th ray, because we're the 4th kingdom. And that's called the ray of harmony through conflict. Not harmony and conflict, harmony through conflict. And that's important because it means that if you're, as life, you and I are sparks of life, we're all monads, remember, we're evolving through all the kingdoms of nature. The great journey through the human kingdom is a journey of life first individualizing, so we rise above our animal instinct, and that's why individualized thought and even ego arises. But at the latter part of the human process is when you start to let go of the ego in order to widen yourself into the whole again, okay? But because the first part of the human journey is so much about building your lower self, which is necessary. When you start recognizing your own duality and sensing a higher prompting, a soulful prompting, you know, what happens is that lower self, you're starting to say, I want to be more of that higher thing I'm sensing in me, I want to live it more, I want to express it more. But the lower self is going to put up a fight. It does. It puts up a fight, you know. And that's the nature of the 4th kingdom of nature is, we're the only kingdom of nature of 7 kingdoms. We're the middle kingdom. We're the only kingdom of nature where the issue has to do with battle between your higher and lower nature. It's not true in the animal kingdom. It's not true in the plant kingdom. There's a whole different dynamics going on in those kingdoms having to do with the evolution of life there. And we could talk about that, or we maybe have in the past, I don't know. And nor is it true in the 5th kingdom. That's the kingdom of the soul, or the 6th kingdom, or the 7th kingdom. But it is true in the human. And that's why I always tell people, look, you know, get used to the hill and valley experience on the journey. You know how that goes, you know? It seems like your spiritual journey is like this, right? Yeah. Get used to it. It's, you know, you get frustrated because you think you have your understanding, you think you're coming into the soul, you think you're living it well, and then you plummet. And then you're lost in the wilderness again, you know, and then you rise again, and then you plummet again, you rise again, and you plummet again. And even the Buddha, even the Christ, when they were going through the human domain, they too would have dealt with that. It's in the very fabric of what it means for life to evolve within the human kingdom. Yes.
With like the suffering in all our paths, but we bring unnecessary suffering on ourselves by straying from the path because of the ego.
Well, that's
But
right.
part of the path as well, I understand it, but
Yeah.
But like Jesus would have he had suffering to go through, but he wouldn't have had done unnecessary suffering for himself.
Jesus was a fourth degree initiate.
Yeah.
So remember, the Master Jesus took I'm getting the signal. I need to repeat the comment or question. Yeah, so he's referencing the idea that Jesus went through necessary suffering as a function of his evolution. And absolutely, but you go through necessary suffering on a lower level, but you're going through necessary suffering as well. The fourth initiation is what Jesus took, and in the Western cultures that's called the crucifixion. In Eastern thinking that's called the great renunciation. But each step in the journey, there's some sort of pain associated with letting go of something. The Tibetan says this, that the whole journey is learning subtle renunciations, little renunciations, in preparation ultimately for the big renunciation, which is the fourth initiation which Jesus took.
But in the computer games terminology, it's learning to play the game better each time you come back.
Okay, okay, yeah. Well, you should be, every incarnation you should be playing the game better. That's true, that's true. I hadn't thought of it.
Just come for a rest.
I have come for a race this time.
I see. So how are you? I mean, do you guys recognize the battle at times? You see? Yeah. And so welcome to the human drama. You know?
What role does the will play in, I mean, you said in the beginning that they complement each other.
Yeah.
And that, putting that into the context of the world, of relating to what's going on in the world right now, there are a lot of people who are activists, and there are other people who are not activists in the kind of, in a visual sense maybe, or they're not seen to be activists. How does the will come into play?
Okay.
Is it just internal will, or,
Well,
internally?
okay, so she's asking how does the will come into play, and she's bringing in the analogy of the activist versus the more spiritually, the person that may not be so active in that sense, but deeply spiritual. And is there a way of, yeah. First realize that I can make a generalization about that, but activism doesn't necessarily mean the implementation of the will. Most activism isn't about will. It's about the utilization of passion and desire as a force that propels. See, here's the thing. All of us should be asking ourselves this. You have these interests. You have a desire to bring something into the world. And you feel that that's from a higher prompting. Fantastic. But how are you going to move it into the world is the question. And what is the source of fuel that you will use to move it into the world? Now, there's a lower source of fuel and a higher source of fuel. Let's put it that way. The lower source of fuel is actually what often propels activism. And I'm not criticizing it because it's actually still under the impulse of a soul impression. And so it does great things. But what that means is this. That's because a person is utilizing the solar plexus, which is the desire energy of emotion, passion. People say, I have a passion to do something. Passion isn't will. Passion is passion. Passion is emotional, and that's a fantastic that's a fuel. And if you've got some insight having to do with doing something in the world to make a difference, whatever that insight is from a soul perspective, when you first wake up to the soul and start to bring it into the world, you will often use the solar plexus as the energy that fuels its manifestation. And that, in society's terms, that's activism in the usual sense. Okay? It's important to keep that in mind. Eventually, much later on the path, the use of the solar plexus is reduced, as the fuel source. And what you start to come into is another fuel source. And that's a fuel source that's actually governed by the crown center and much more about higher will. Because will is not emotion. It's not emotion. And it's not an energy that is horizontal, it's vertical. I'm using geometries here. Passion is horizontal, whereas will is vertical. And one of the things I want to get into today is the so-called establishing of the point of tension. That's where we're going to get into this discussion of the will, because you can only utilize will to establish the inner point of tension. So I'll stop on that point because I'll be embellishing that more a bit later. Okay? Okay. Any other questions?